And then that leads us from Citizen Swing and those two records into the Mayfield Four. That's next on the map.
Yeah, Mayfield 4. So that was the first band that got like a legit major label deal. We signed with Epic in, I believe, early 97.
Mm.
And we were, when what happened, it was interesting because Citizen Swing broke up in 96. And what happened was that the drummer left to go play with a band called Shovel Jerk, who was they were a band that got signed to Capricorn, which I believe is the Allman Brothers label, and they were a great band, had some really great songs. So my drummer Mike went to go play with them, and then their drummer was like, which just so happened to be Zia from way back in high school, who played in Bittersweet with me, and we were like, well, let's do this again, man.
Yeah.
So we did, and we somehow got a major label deal within, it was under a year, and we that was crazy. That was a very exciting time. You know, it's interesting when I think about that era. I get excited because it was all the rock and roll cliches you hear about. You know, were these kids in Spokane, and although half the band actually, Zia by that point lived in Seattle, as did our bass player Marty. He lived in Seattle as well, and then Craig and I lived in Spokane. So we literally travel, 5 hours every other weekend to each other's city to practice, like gigs. And then labels started coming around, and we had they were flying us to New York and showing up at our house with limousines, and back in the the end,
the wine and dining of the A&R,
right,
or Amex card.
Exactly. Back when that sort of thing still happened, but it was exciting. It was cool, and we got to work with like our first big producer, who was Jerry Harrison, who was from the Talking Heads, and learned a lot from that whole experience.
And Epic is and this is also at a time when the brand name of remember eras where you would buy something based on what label it was on, knowing that was like its stamp of quality. And Epic has such a great legacy as its own label. And I'm trying to think, gosh, in the late 90s, I remember Oasis was on Epic in the States, probably at that time, right?
They were Oasis was, Pearl Jam was, Rage Against the Machine was, and that was actually part of the reason that we signed with that label. Was Columbia was interested, RCA was interested, a cool label called Time Bomb was interested, and part of the reason we ended up going with Epic, besides the fact that you're talking about, like some of the records you grow up listening to, and you look at like what
that Epic logo is like.
Yeah, exactly.
Having that on there.
We even insisted on using the old Epic logo
Nice.
on the first record. But like the second record I ever had was the first Boston record, so that was Epic, and so to be on that was really cool. But yeah, I mean, we were really feeling the love from them, so we signed with them, and we're with them for the next 5 years, I think.
And that first record there's the Marvin Gaye song on there. It still has that. It seems very transitional in terms of your discography looking at the arc of it, in that it has some of the soul and funk a little bit from earlier stuff that you were doing, but is also steering more towards, and certainly on that second record, from what I've heard of it, is more hard rock oriented and things like that. Talk to me a little bit about that transition and the kind of songs you were interested in writing, and what part this played in, cementing your identity, so to speak.
Right. Well, that was interesting because the first record was born out of being isolated and not doing a lot of touring, except in the Pacific Northwest here. And so we weren't exposed to a lot of the rest of the nation, what was happening, other than what you'd see through MTV or that back when they'd still show videos. And I was definitely, once again, like I alluded to earlier, a little bit of an identity crisis. I discovered Jeff Buckley a few years prior, and you can hear on some of those songs there was a heavy dose of that, and it was really into Radiohead, And that was something that, in fact, when we were making, right before we were about to make that record, the Fallout record, the first Mayfield record, Jerry Harrison, before we went in the studio, said, don't listen to, because the new Radiohead was coming out, OK Computer. And he's like, do not listen to it. And I was like, why? He goes, because you'll end up absorbing it, and you want to, that'll become part of the DNA for the record. You want to be your own thing. And and so that was a really great piece of advice. So by the time we got to the second record, we toured pretty extensively, like over a year, just in a van in a trailer. And what I learned as a writer was the idea of not being afraid to rock. Like if you're gonna go out there and get in front of people, what gets people moving, what gets kind of brings the overall energy of the room up. And I became less afraid of the riff, because a lot of that was just what was happening in the '90s. There was this reaction where riff, not with Rage Against the Machine definitely shoots that theory to hell because they were based on that riff and it was powerful. But
yeah, they were like, what if we did Led Zeppelin and someone rapped over it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Genius, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it was that second Skin record we were starting to kind of, and as a writer, I felt like I was starting to find my place. It was starting to come together, but I still had a long ways to go.
It's interesting what you reference again about the absorption thing, because I think that's something people who aren't artists or don't work in the creative field maybe don't quite understand, because certainly there are knockoffs where it's like, okay, this band is just doing this thing or whatever. But I think it's much more common that it's coming from a place of purity, and it's just unconscious, even of absorbing kind of vibe, not some, I mean, lifting a melody or something is one thing, but kind of vibe because every great band is really just the sum of like all the ingredients, right, that went into making those people who they are, and then comes out in a unique way because of their own experiences, but it's pieces of other stuff. It's funny because right in that same era, I was still living in Indiana where I grew up, and tie this into two things we're talking about here. We had a band who was, local band who hadn't really played much outside of the Midwest, that went into that same situation where they were being courted by major labels and taken out to dinners and flown to New York and flown to California. And they ended up signing with an imprint called Sony 550.
Mm-hmm.
And they made a really cool, it was a band called Old Pike. And they were, one of the guitar players actually is in the band My Morning Jacket now. So he did okay. But, yeah. But they were like a cool kind of Americana, early Springsteen, Stonesy kind of thing, made a cool record. So they went on tour with the band Train, who I think they were label mates with and was also just taking off. And, they toured together quite a bit. They watched each other play every night. They jammed together, different times. And Train puts out a song called Drops of Jupiter. And it is very much an Old Pike song.
Really?
To the point that the Old Pike guys went, hey, and the Train guys went, oops. And they, wow. They share co-writing and publishing, and, it all got worked out amicably. But it was just a total, like, those guys weren't like, we're going to rip off this part of this Old Pike song. It was just like, our bands are very similar. We're hanging out all the time. We're on the same label. We're on tour together. And, it ties into what you were talking about absorbing things. And it also ties into, I think especially really every decade until this one, there's an idea when you're a musician, right, that all it's going to take is a major label. When the major label gets involved, it's a magic wand, and it's like I've been discovered, and now I'm going to be put into the machine, and whatever voodoo goes on with making you a successful rock musician, like I'm plugged in, I'm on my way. And the reality, of course, is, it's a small percentage of the acts that even make it that far that then make it to the next couple of stages, and how many stories there are of I imagine every town has their local hero band that almost got there. Right. So as the Mayfield Four, after that second record was out, was there a trying to think of the right way to describe it, like a coming down period almost of like, man, I thought this was going one way and it's kind of plateaued, and what do I do now? Did you have any kind of
Oh yeah.
crisis of faith in that moment?
Crisis was an understatement. It was a tough time. Actually, but I think probably maybe the most difficult time in my post childhood life. Just because, yeah, like you so beautifully articulated, you think that when you get the big deal, then you're off to the races. And what we didn't realize was that I think that at that time, a manager told me only 5% of the bands who get signed ever actually sell any, even recoup the advance that they get for the records.
And that was the label's excuse for why the deals were so disproportionately in favor of the label versus the band, because they were like, we're taking all these risks and spending all this money on all these bands, and only a couple are going to work.
Exactly.
And then those couple that work get to pay for everybody else.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that was something that I learned. And by 2002, I'm back at home, not touring anymore, and was really so I always, when I talk about this period, I always use the word crestfallen, because that's, I think, the word that sums it up. I just felt really just disillusioned, and I think really wondering what the next step was. And I went back to teaching guitar, and I fortunately met my future wife, and that was, thank goodness for that, man, because I was not in a good place mentally. So yeah, there was a well over a year of trying to figure out what was next, and I didn't even know if I wanted to be a recording artist. In fact, I even had an offer to audition for something that ended up being a big band, and I respectfully declined because I just knew I wasn't mentally there. I would be useless. So yeah, it was a needed power down and reboot.
And your identity gets so wrapped up as a person in when you have a career in the arts and it's something you love and are passionate about. That's just so much who you are. And then you wake up one morning and you're not the guy from the Mayfield Four, and you don't have a tour itinerary in front of you or what. Yeah, it's a whole mind trip, right? Where you have to, like you said, power down and kind of reboot. And
Absolutely.
I would imagine there was a moment there where you thought, I guess I'm going to be one of those guys that got to make some records and see part of the world, and that was that.